Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the April installment of ILA's Leadership Perspectives webinar series. This installment is entitled Being the Boss, featuring Professor Linda Hill. I am Ashley Woolham, Coordinator of Member Services and Marketing for the International Leadership Association, and I will be moderating this webinar. Before we start, please note the following. First, this webinar will be archived. If you missed something, would like to hear the webinar again, or would like to see the presentation again, they will be published to the ILA website within 24 hours. You will receive an email with instructions for accessing the archived recording after the webinar has ended. Second, we welcome your questions throughout the webinar. At any time, you may ask questions by typing them into the questions box of your webinar control panel, which is currently displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address your questions during the second half of the webinar. Please note, however, that we may not be able to address each question we receive. Third, 4 participants of today's webinar session will be randomly selected to receive a complimentary copy of the book on which this webinar is based. These winners will be announced at the end of the webinar session. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Linda Hill is the Wallace Brett Donham Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. She is the faculty chair of the Leadership Initiative and has chaired numerous Harvard Business School executive education programs, including the Young Presidents Organization President Seminar and the High Potentials Leadership Program. Professor Hill is a member of the boards of directors of State Street Corporation, Cooper Industries, and Harvard Business Publishing. She's a trustee of the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund USA, the Bridgespan Group, and Bryn Mawr College. She also serves on the editorial board of Leadership Quarterly. Backed by nearly 30 years of management research, Professor Hill has authored articles, course modules, and popular books, including Being the Boss, The 3 Imperatives of Becoming a Great Leader, and Becoming a Manager, How New Managers Master the Challenges of Leadership. Linda, welcome. Please proceed.
Thank you. It's certainly a privilege to be with all of you today, and thank you for your time and attention. What I'd like to do today is talk about the work that is presented in the latest book I've done called Being the Boss, The 3 Imperatives for Becoming a Great Leader. And I'd like to begin by making an introduction, telling you a little bit more about how I actually spend my time so you'll know the point of view that I'm going to be taking in our conversation today. But before I do that, I also need to acknowledge my co-author, Kent Lineback, because this book would not have been possible without Kent, as I will make clear as we go through our time together. So as was mentioned, I am the faculty chair of the Leadership Initiative here at the school, and I think I've been selected to fulfill that role because I'm more of a generalist than a specialist. My work actually is in 3 areas. The first is on how people learn to lead. So I study people as they go through major career transitions to try to find out what they find most difficult about a transition, and then what resources do they rely on to help them master their new assignment. The second area I do work on is leadership and innovation. And I'm writing a book with the former chief technology officer of Pixar and with a young woman, a Generation Y, member of Generation Y, on leadership for innovation. And finally, most of probably my consulting is in the area of leadership and sort of implementation of global strategies. And in that regard, I do a lot of work on how to help organizations improve cross-organizational relationships so that they can deliver a global strategy, and also on some of the talent management issues that come up, particularly in doing business in emerging markets. And so the work on innovation and on globalization have impacted sort of the thoughts that you find in Being the Boss. But as I said, that this particular book really focuses mostly on work I've done on how people learn to lead. And I started by looking at people early in their careers and have gone all the way up to, in fact, doing some coaching with people who are about to become CEOs. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn to the meat of our conversation today. And before I talk about the 3 imperatives and what those are, I'd like to place them in context by briefly reviewing with you how we have thought about what it takes to build a competitive business today, because this book is really based on that understanding of what it takes to be competitive. When I first arrived at the business school in the 80s, I think when we thought about why it was that some organizations sort of were winning and others were losing, we really focused on whether or not an organization had the right strategy. And what we actually saw at that time was that many organizations, frankly, did not have a strategy, or if they did, they didn't necessarily have one that would allow them to be competitive. By, I think, the late 80s, early 90s, we began to really focus on the fact that it wasn't enough simply to have the right strategy. You had to also be able to execute and deliver that strategy. And executing strategies become ever more difficult, as you all know, living in your organizations, because customers are becoming ever more demanding, but they don't want to pay proportionally more for the services and products they expect from us. So as one of my colleagues has put it, we all have to learn how to cook sweet and sour when we're delivering our strategies, that is, grow the top line, but also manage costs, because the focus on value is there no matter what industry you look at. So you have to have the right strategy, and you have to be able to execute that strategy. Well, I think in the 90s, when we began to see a number of companies that had historically been quite successful begin to fail, we also began to understand that it wasn't enough to simply have the right strategy, be able to execute that strategy, but also you had to be able to adapt and change that strategy over time, because we were living in a very dynamic business environment. And so there was a great deal of focus on adaptation and change. And indeed, we saw that those organizations who were good at execution were not necessarily good at adaptation and change. And in fact, particularly not necessarily so good at innovation. And as we all know today, if you want to be able to have a competitive business, not only do you have to be able to have the right strategy and execute it and adapt and change it, but you must be able to build an organization that can do, if you will, breakthrough innovations more than once. And so the pressure of being successful, what it takes to be successful nowadays, is indeed harder than it used to be, I guess you'd say, 20 years ago. And the global economy is not only very dynamic and complex, but pretty unforgiving, as you all know. Given that reality, one of the things we have come to see in particular is that we can't run our businesses in the way that's sort of described on this, that you sort of see depicted on this particular slide. This is a slide from one of my colleagues, Rosabeth Moss-Cantor's book, in which she talks about organizations tend to be very, be pyramids, and we tend to think that senior management's going to make those big bets, and you hope that the front line will do the bottom. That's sort of the quality movement, that you'll get that kind of continuous improvement. But fundamentally, we now know that organizations that sort of try to work this way just don't work in today's environment. And indeed, what we have in many organizations is we have organizations that have silos. So what you really have is you have a lot of these pyramids. And frankly, change and innovation normally has to happen across an organization. And if you're siloed and you're trying to do things in the way that's depicted here, the probability of you being able to adapt and change as is necessary over time is very unlikely indeed. So again, what we see is organizations that can execute, and sometimes organizations set themselves up this way to be able to execute, are not going to be able to do the kind of change and adaptation necessary in today's competitive environment. And as many of you know, if you know the work, of course, of people like Warren Bennis or John Kotter, what they talk about is organizations need to have both sort of leadership and management. Management is about execution, and leadership is about dealing with change and innovation. And indeed, what you need to have in your organization if you want to be successful is really you need to have leadership throughout the organization, not just at the top but at the bottom. And so one of the things that I find myself having to think a lot about when I'm going out and talking to companies is we talk about what percentage of those people who you have in positions of authority actually are failing as leaders. And that percentage really matters nowadays because of what it takes to be competitive. And indeed, I think more and more organizations are trying to keep track of the costs of the organization of not having enough leadership talent. And for sure, as I wander the globe, particularly as organizations are trying to take advantage of different kinds of global opportunities in new markets, as for example the emerging markets, they discover they do not have enough leadership to actually get done what they'd like to get done in the business, to really open up new markets, develop the products and services they'd like to, because indeed they have a shortage of leadership. And one of the things we're seeing here at the Harvard Business School is that we're having more and more interest in sending people to our executive programs for high potentials. And the dilemma that we see is that what used to be okay, so if you used to be, if you will, I don't know, sort of a mediocre or an average boss, whatever that might mean, that's not good enough anymore because of this reality of what it takes to be competitive. You actually have to be a great boss. And so, in fact, Kent and I came together because Kent is an executive, and Kent sort of sees in his experience that there are too many people out there, in his opinion, who really aren't very good at, quote, being the boss or providing leadership. And we have to sort of beat that up given the realities of what it takes to build a successful business, as well as he says, the cost, not only the financial cost of businesses, but the human cost of businesses of really having bosses that aren't really doing what they need to do in his mind, in his experience. It's just a problem that we need to address if we can. So he approached me because of my research in this area, and I was very happy to write this book with him because what I had seen in my experience is lots of well-intended and very talented people who failed really to fulfill their ambitions for themselves or their organizations because, in fact, they weren't able to be, if you will, great bosses. And so what we tried to do is think through my experience and his experience to figure out what are the common misconceptions and missteps that are getting in the way of people becoming really great bosses. And bosses that can do two things: bosses that can address performance gaps, that is, gaps between where their team is or their organization is and where their team should be, and we consider these performance gaps to mostly be about execution, and bosses who can also address opportunity gaps, gaps between where their teams or organizations are and where those teams or organizations could be. So the should piece of it really for us is about execution, and the could be is for us about sort of innovation and change. And we think if you're going to be a great boss in today's organization, you have to be able to address both of these gaps, these performance gaps and these opportunity gaps. So our conversations that led to how we conceived of this book and wrote this book really were based on that background of looking at what's going on in business and figuring out how do you help bosses be not only value creators, that is, people who can help with execution, but also game changers, people who can help your organizations really make those changes and do the innovation that you need in the organization. So based on that understanding, we began to write about what it takes to be, if you will, from good to great. And what we were talking about here is it's not enough simply, again, to, as you all know because you're in this field, one of the things we all have to keep in mind is that you don't become a great leader in a few months. You become a great leader over years. It really is a journey, and it's a personal journey. No one can teach you how to lead, but in fact you can learn how to lead. Even though many people believe that leaders are born, we all know that leaders are in fact made, and they're made from their experiences and relationships. But because it is a process of self-development, what you really need to help people with is self-directed learning. And so Kent and I tried to write this book in a way, not only in terms of the content, but the way we presented the information to help people really be sort of practice those skills of self-directed learning. So our assumption is that leadership is just like any craft. It's something that must be practiced, and it takes a great deal of practice and discipline to actually become an expert at it. And what do these really excellent bosses actually do? Well, this reality, I think they have a certain mindset about what they're doing, and I'll come back to this. I'm not going to walk us through this entire slide, but just to raise a few issues. One issue that is a very important one is that, of course, even though you are, quote, the boss, you should not be relying on your formal authority very much as your primary source of influence. It's not very helpful because, frankly, many of the people upon whom you are dependent to get your job done are people over whom you do not have formal authority, bosses and peers. On the other hand, even for those people that you do have formal authority over, formal authority is a very limited source of power. And even though we call the book, being the boss, which makes one think of the formal authority, what we really try to write about in this book is you got to get away from that and think about other sources of power and influence you can build to get your job done. And for sure, we also talk about the challenges not only coping with today or the complexity of execution, it's also about coping with tomorrow and sort of change and innovation. So again, we've written the book and we sort of present the ideas to focus not only on the performance gaps, but the opportunity gaps that you as a boss need to be addressing. So we've ended up in looking at our work thinking about sort of three imperatives of leadership. And before I describe those three imperatives, let me take another moment to say why we actually did call the book Being the Boss, given many people have sort of asked us, isn't that boss is sort of an old word? Well, boss on the one hand is an old word, but we all know what a boss is. And frankly, if you're working globally, it turns out that boss means sort of the same thing to people all over the world, whereas leadership and management all are words that have various connotations to people. And in fact, we think that unless you really confront the fact that, quote, you are the boss and the formal authority and think through what that really means, there's no way you're going to be effective at sort of influencing the people you need to influence to get your job done. And indeed, the first imperative of leadership or being a boss is really to manage yourself. Because again, as I said, being the boss is about or leadership is really about using yourself as an instrument to get things done in the organization. It's a self-development process. So you have to understand yourself so that you can match your intent with your impact. So we start with that first imperative of managing yourself. The second imperative is managing your network. And we focus on it. The managing your network piece is really about managing relationships with those people upon whom you are dependent to get your job done, but frankly over whom you have no formal authority. If you don't manage your network properly, you don't create the conditions necessary for your team to be effective. That is, that group of people that you actually do have formal authority over. So indeed, we think many people, when they think about being the boss or leadership, they think about those people who report to them. But we think that's sort of the last place you should go, because if you start there, you're too likely to rely on your formal authority as the source of influence. Instead, you should start with yourself, because you're using yourself as the instrument to get things done. Then you need to think about creating the conditions necessary for your team to be successful. So think about relationships with peers and bosses. And then finally, think about the team. So those are the three imperatives that I'd like to sort of walk you through some of what we have looked at and found to be important if you want to be an effective leader today. The first imperative is manage yourself. I've actually, I think, talked a lot about this one. Again, too often we focus on the fact that, quote, I'm the boss. Frankly, nobody really cares on this is not a very powerful source of influence, particularly today with Generation Y. I don't think it ever was necessarily all that effective. Even if you go to societies or cultures where they're very hierarchical and, hierarchy matters a whole lot, if you really want to get people to buy in and be committed to whatever it is you're asking them to do, using your formal authority has never been a very successful way to do that, because frankly, when you're using formal authority, that's mostly should be thought of as a form of influence. It's about coercion. The other side of it that becomes a problem is if you focus on, so I'm your friend. When you are trying to manage people, your source of influence should not be your friendship. That is not to say that you don't have friends at work. Of course you have friends at work. But one of the things we know in this very tough environment we live in, we often have to do what one of my colleagues refers to as necessary evils. That is, we have to do harm to one individual for the good of the whole. And so indeed, friendship is not a means to an end. It's just friendship for the sake of friendship. But too often we find that people either rely on formal authority or, if you will, I'm your friend as ways of influencing people, and neither one of these approaches to sort of influence of people really makes a whole lot of sense. So you got to kind of deal with what are the sources of influence that you should be relying on. And fundamentally what we see, and I don't think this will surprise any of us, is that basically what you want to build is sort of caring human relationships with people that are based on trust. And there really are two dimensions of trust that we talk a lot about and we see really make a difference, and I think this should make sense to you. I know it's not rocket science, but we sometimes forget it. People are assessing our character, and that is how they assess whether we're well-intended. Do we want to do the right thing? And they're assessing our competence. Or do we know what the right thing to do is? So do we want to do the right thing? Do we know what the right thing to do is? This is the basis, and you always want to be paying attention to the kinds of evidence you can provide to people to give them a sense that, in fact, you can trust them. And so the relationships you want to build are built on character and competence. And indeed, in today's organizations where there's a lot of change going on, people often will get maybe mixed messages about your character because you are making some tough choices about them, going back to those necessary evils, and or you can't tell them everything. You're not as transparent as they might like about certain things because of decisions that might be being made. And in terms of competence, frankly, many of us find ourselves having to do things that we're actually new at. So people are constantly looking for evidence about your character and your competence. You need to be aware of that in all that you do because you are the instrument. So how you carry yourself, how you manage your emotions, all of this, the EQ side of it, as you all know, matters a great deal if, in fact, people are going to trust you. In terms of managing yourself, that's the first piece. The second imperative, as I said, is managing your network. This is about creating those conditions for the success of your team. A couple things here. This is also the part of the book in which we really talk about the politics of organizational life. And many people, as we know, try to avoid those politics and say, let me just sort of do my job. I'm not going to worry about the politics. Well, organizations are inherently political entities, and so you have to worry about them. Otherwise, again, you're not going to create the conditions for the success of your group. You have to think about what are those sources of political conflict in my organization and how can I manage those so that my people will have the right resources, or my team will have the right resources and will have the right expectations set for us. So here what we really look at is we try to help people really think about, who are you really dependent on to get your job done? And with that understanding of who you're dependent on to get your job done, how do you sort of weave your own web of influence to work through those politics that have become ever more complex in the kind of matrix organizations we see today as people are trying to sort of do business in the global economy. So the first question, I'd ask you all to think about as you're listening to this part of the presentation is, who are you really dependent on? And you want to make sure that you overestimate those dependencies. And, and again, I don't necessarily want to use hierarchy as a way sort of to identify dependencies. I want to get stuck on that. On the other hand, I think sometimes we forget that we are as dependent on people who are junior to us as they are dependent on us. So you want to think broadly about that, inside and outside your organization. Who are you dependent on to get your job done? And again, you want to think about those peer relationships. And it turns out that one of the primary concerns of sponsors of people who come to our high potential programs these days is helping the executives who come be better at building effective peer relationships so they can get the integrated work of the organization done, or they can do more innovation. So you want to think broadly about these dependencies. And then you got to build three kinds of networks. The first kind of network you have to build is the strategic network. The network you rely on to help you understand what's going on in your organization, so you really get what the priorities are, what the constraints are, and also what's going on in the world around you more broadly that will affect, if you will, your identification of performance gaps and opportunity gaps. So when you're thinking about your strategic network, this is the network you use, again, to figure out what your strategy should be for your team. You want to think about building a network that goes out, that really exposes you to the world more broadly. And if you're a person who often finds that you're blindsided by things happening in your organization, then that may be because you haven't taken the time to build a strategic network that lets you know what's really going on in your organization. So you want to build out. You also want to build an organization that is a network that is diverse, because you want to have different perspectives. So you want to make sure that your friends aren't simply friends of your friends. You want to have some people in that group who are people who have different points of view. That can make it harder on the one hand because you may not enjoy being with those people as much and you might have a little conflict, but in fact if you're not building a diverse network that sort of reaches out, you're much more likely not to in fact be able to identify the performance gaps and the opportunity gaps that your organization or your team should be addressing. The second kind of network you need to build is your operational network. This is a network you build with people that you are dependent on to get your job done on a more daily basis. And what I'd encourage you to do now and perhaps later is to think about what is the quality of the relationship you have with those people in your network. Do you have mutual expectations? Do you trust each other? Do they trust you? Do you trust them? And is there mutual influence in the relationship? If you don't have mutual influence and mutual expectations, not so likely you're going to have mutual trust, going back to character and competence. And indeed, often what I find when I'm brought in to maybe work with a group or do some coaching or try to help repair some relationships is fundamentally it breaks down because there hasn't been sort of mutual expectation setting or mutual influence. So again, what I would recommend is you think about that strategic network so that you can identify performance gaps and opportunity gaps to be addressed. You think about that operational network to figure out whether once you figure out those gaps, do you have the right relationships, right quality of relationships to actually get things done and so to close those gaps. Some of you may have, if you look at your operational network, you might have what's referred to as an entrepreneurial network here. Indeed, an executive that I know had a network that really reached out, and like an entrepreneur, she's able to bring together resources and different groups of people to get things done. She can bring together capital, talent, whatever it might be in that notion, and so she has a very broad network. She can keep up with what's going on in the world out there, and that really helps her, and it's quite diverse. Others of you may have what we refer to, like Sam, as a more cohesive network. This is a network where your friends, again, are your friends' friends. Everybody knows each other, like sort of a small village. Now, this kind of network can be very helpful when you want to go to your operational network of getting things done because people trust and know each other so you can move quickly. If you're in an organization and you're trying to close one of those gaps, you usually have to build some kind of coalition to help you get it done because that is the only way you're going to do it. And if you have a cohesive network like this, you can get those coalitions together to actually begin to close some of those gaps. But in the ideal world, what you'd like to do, who you'd like to be is Sue here, because Sue has a network that sort of reaches out towards Tarun that gives her that access to, if you will, the strategic kind of network, that points of view, different points of view, reaching out so she'll know what's happening. But also, Sue is a part of a cohesive network, again, so she can pull together those coalitions to get things done. So first you've got to manage yourself, then you've got to manage your network, and you want to think about, given who I'm dependent on, given the nature of my own network, really, am I in the right position to get my job done? And then, of course, there's a relationship with the boss. Many of you live in sort of matrix organizations where, frankly, it's bosses. One of the things I can tell you about that is the most common mistake we see is people pay attention to one boss and not the other, and that always ends up being a problem because that other boss is equally your boss, even that dotted line one. And that often can be because it's the boss you like better or the one who's sitting closer to you. But we spend a fair amount of time talking about how do you build partnerships with bosses and what kind of evidence is your boss looking for to know that your character and competence are what they need to be. Sometimes the kind of evidence you think that you're providing or that should matter is not necessarily the same that your boss is paying attention to. The last imperative is manage your team. Again, I want to get through these kind of quickly so we can leave time for questions and I can elaborate on whatever point you'd like to do. In terms of managing your team, again, there are three pieces to the puzzle here we try to focus on. One is defining that future. And here what we see is that you really want to focus on the purpose and not simply the direction in which you're going. It turns out that purpose really matters. Meaning really matters today to people when you are trying to get them to take the kinds of risks and work as hard as you want them to work, because we want them to be very committed and energized as they're doing the work necessary in your organization. The other piece is you've got to turn that group into a team. Then, of course, team members are individuals too. I think the first thing I've already sort of elaborated on a bit. Talk a lot about how to build your plan and your priorities. Again, who did you consult? This would go to, again, the quality of your strategic network, whether you've consulted the right people to figure out what those priorities should be. And then who have you told? Do people really know what you're trying to get done? Again, when I look at what goes wrong in many settings, sometimes people simply did not know what your priorities were. Right? You're working with a peer, they thought you were doing X, Y, Z because they didn't get. It wasn't clear to them what you were trying to get done. So I'd encourage you to think about your plan and who did you consult in developing it. So is it the right plan in the first place, right priorities, and who knows about it, what you're really trying to get done? And what we see in organizations nowadays, particularly ones that are highly innovative, is that there's a great deal more transparency than there used to be about what those priorities are. And many intranets in many of the companies I'm looking at really provide ways for people to make it very clear what the priorities are of their particular group. If you have that, I think it's a little bit difficult to get used to the kind of transparency you can see with regard to this, but it certainly does help things as you move forward and try to reduce some of the conflicts that inevitably come up in the kinds of complex organizations we live in today. In terms of the team piece, just a couple of things here I'd like to say. You all know, and I think we all have been reading about the importance of culture in a team or an organization for understanding why that team is effective. And indeed, the evidence just continues to grow that it's sort of, if you will, the so-called soft side of the organization that really makes the most direct difference to whether or not your organization is going to be effective or your team is going to be effective. In assessing your team, I'd encourage you to think about at least three criteria. The first is, of course, some kind of performance criteria that I'm sure you all pay attention to those, but it's not easy to measure performance, and your organizations probably, many of you might feel like you have so many different metrics to pay attention to, it's kind of difficult to figure which ones really do matter. That, again, is why it's important to have that strategic network so you can kind of figure out which ones really do matter. But again, you want to first assess performance. And when you're thinking about performance, you want to make sure you're paying attention to what others think those metrics should be, not what simply you think they should be. The second sort of bucket of effectiveness criteria you should pay attention to really is sort of how satisfied are the individuals who are working on your team or in your organization, and are they growing? Are they being developed? If they are not satisfied and growing, you're going to have retention issues. And you know, many of you know, in many markets these days, these retention issues are significant. It is hard to hold people. It is hard to replace people. And I think now that we're coming out of the recession, many companies are finding they haven't spent a whole lot of time to making sure people are growing and are satisfied. And now that people have some options, they're beginning to leave, right when you really need that talent to take advantage and sort of grow your business. So for sure you want to pay attention to performance. You also want to pay attention to, are people growing? And are they satisfied? The other thing we see is if you haven't paid attention to that piece of the puzzle, when you go to make a change, that group of people are the group of people that can be most resistant to change. You can have these big blocks of resistors because, in fact, they have not been satisfied, or more importantly, they've plateaued. You haven't helped them develop. And then the final criteria you want to pay attention to is whether or not your team or your organization is able to collectively learn and adapt together. So you might have people who are individually growing and developing and able to change, but as a group, you're not able to do that. And I think that becomes a very important differentiator between the sort of, if you will, the good bosses and the great bosses, those that can build these teams or these organizations that in fact can learn and adapt together. Now in terms of culture, there are many determinants. And you don't have control over all of these determinants, even if you're the CEO of an organization. But the one piece of the puzzle that you should have some control over is your own personal style. And your own personal style does indeed affect the culture of your team or your organization. And there are a number of dimensions of style that one can pay attention to. And I'd like to just, again, not to overwhelm you, but I do want to give you the overview, because I think what Kent and I found is it's too easy when we get very, very busy to only pay attention to one piece of what it means to be an effective boss. And what we tried to do in coming up with these 3 imperatives was to come up with a fairly simple framework so you can kind of think every day, where am I in terms of managing myself? Where am I in terms of managing my network? Where am I in terms of managing this team? So again, keeping that broad picture in mind. We're now in the team piece, and we're thinking about the culture piece of your team. One of the determinants of the culture, as I said, is your style, your own preferences. So this is sort of a list of some of the kinds of leadership style dimensions that we all are aware of. I just want to point out one or two of these right now. One is, first, do you focus on the individual or do you focus on the group? Some of you may much prefer to get work done one-on-one, particularly if it's work that involves conflict, and therefore you don't do so much work, if you will, in your group. The question I would ask you today is to think about, are there things or are there topics or decisions that the group should be making collectively and that you should not simply be doing one-on-one? That relates to, again, that last criteria of effectiveness I mentioned about whether you have a group that can adapt and change and learn together. So again, you want to think about whether your preferences are leading your team to have a culture that is in fact not as suited as it might be to building a very effective group or team over time, a group or organization over time. The other is, are you more supportive or are you more confrontational? Again, it's important to be confrontational because that does indeed raise the standards, if you will. People will work harder if you're confrontational. On the other hand, if you're not supportive, people will not share their ideas with you. And in today's environment where innovation really matters, we have seen in our own work that unless you're supportive and provide some psychological safety, you really are not unleashing the talents and the ideas of your group. So we know that the most effective, if you will, leaders are very versatile, and they can move all along these dimensions. I've just circled spots on here to give you some sense of no reason really, just to say you want to think about where you are. But what we really know is that the most effective leaders are able to go all across these dimensions and adapt their particular behavior to the person or to the task in front of them. But many of us are not that adaptive. Frankly, we have preferences. And you want to understand those preferences because those preferences represent your style. And again, your style will have an impact on culture. The other piece of the puzzle that I just want to say is that, as I said, you want to focus on the team, but you also want to look at the individuals and how you're treating the individuals, because the individuals matter too and not just the group. And what we see in our work is that people want opportunity. They want opportunity to develop themselves. They want opportunity to have impact. And they want to have impact on an organization or a team, or about that they really sort of care about the purpose of that team or that organization. So again, what we do see is that purpose really matters these days, and so you need to help people understand why you're working on what you're working on, what you're doing. It doesn't matter. Even if you're, quote, selling shoes, there's a purpose about what you're up to, a why that people want to build into, so they can sort of take their own personal identity and meaning that they're looking for and work their own talents, sort of match those with the collective good. And so the kind of culture you build in your group or your team really does determine whether or not you deliver on the promise you've made to them about the kind of opportunity they're going to have if they come and they're a part of your team, of your organization. And so the psychological contract that you're building with people really, really matters and gets played out in the culture of your organization. But what you've got to figure out is, for each individual, why are they with you? Why have they joined the organization? What are they looking for, and how can you help them achieve what their aspirations are, or their personal ambitions are, and how do you help those get matched with what the team or organization is trying to do? I think I'll leave this piece about demographic differences for the moment, and just end by a few comments about the last kind of network you need to think about, and that's your developmental network. But to set that up, let me first talk and remind us all about how it is that people actually learn how to lead or do their jobs. Ideally, what you've done is you've gone to an organization where there's a good fit between your values and the values of the organization. Because if there's not a good fit, it is going to be very hard for you to be authentic. And indeed, as we all know, none of us like to follow, if you will, leaders or be involved with leaders that we don't experience as authentic. Because one of the things about leadership is it's about an emotional connection. And so hopefully, again, there's a good fit between your values and the values of your organization. There may not be a perfect fit, or there may not have been a perfect fit between what the job you hoped you hoped they were going to give you and what you were actually capable of. Because most of us, when we go and take a new position, particularly if we're talented, we're looking for jobs or opportunities where it's a stretch assignment. There's not a perfect match. People are betting on our potential. So you get a stretch assignment. Hopefully you get to meet some people that you like and you respect, and then you develop expertise. Expertise is very specific to that organization. And indeed, if you have some general competencies and if you worked for a competitor and you move over, it turns out you're still, until you're there for a while and see how they do things, you only have general competencies. You don't have expertise. One of the things we know from lots of research now is that people are not as portable as they think. None of us are really free agents, or very few of us are really free agents. So you get in, you have the stretch assignments, you have the relationships, you get expertise. That is a source of power. That is a source of power you primarily want to be relying on as you're trying to get your job done and managing relationships with people, whether you have formal authority over them or not. Once you have expertise, you deliver results, you build a track record, you get credibility. Track record and credibility are another source of power that are very, very important. Once you have built that credibility, because you have that track record, you get a bigger assignment or a bigger stretch assignment. You get your relationships, your network of relationships grows. You get more expertise. Now, if things work the way I've just described them to you, that is what we all would consider to be a meritocracy. The people who get the stretch assignments are the people who deserve them because they've actually produced results. And indeed, when you're thinking about what kinds of positions to take in terms of your own development to help you move from being good to great, you want to think not so much, if you will, obviously we all need to make money, but you really want to think about three things about the position that you might be considering. Are you going to get to work on things that are very relevant? Are you going to have some autonomy, and is it going to be visible? Now, first, visibility. Visibility matters because if people don't know you did it, you're not going to get that credibility kick. You're not going to get that track record kick. So you do need to figure out an appropriate way in your organization, quote, to be visible. The second one, autonomy matters because if you don't have autonomy, you obviously can't identify those gaps, performance gaps, opportunity gaps, and show that you can begin to close those. You have no opportunity to show that, in fact, you can be, if you will, a game changer. And finally, if you don't get to work on what's really relevant, you don't have a chance to learn that, which is really critical expertise for contributing to the success of your organization. Now, when I talk about relevance, it may not be relevant simply today. It may be something that's going to be relevant over time. So I think you need to think about that pretty broadly. But the whole point is, and we know this from lots of research, you can only learn what you get to do because we learn from experience. We don't learn, if you will, in school. I hate to say that as a professor, but we really do learn at work. So if you don't get to do it, you can't learn it. And what we actually see is if people aren't careful and thinking strategically about their careers, they actually become de-skilled. They don't have a chance to develop, again, that relevant expertise. And once you become de-skilled, or once you have large numbers of people in your organization who become de-skilled, again, you have these blocks of people who are going to resist change. So on the one hand, when you're thinking about position, is it relevant? Do you have autonomy? Will you be visible? And then you also want to think about the network. Who will you get to interact with? Are these people who will be very helpful to you in your strategic network or your operational network? Ideally, you want to become more central in the network as opposed to be on the edge of it, because if you're the center, like Indeed was, then you can sort of be the broker of relationships. You can be the bridger, and that's a very important position to be in. Now, it's hard to build meritocracies. It's particularly hard to build meritocracies when you have, in a global economy, where you have a lot of diversity. And the arrow that makes that difficult is the one that goes between stretch assignments and network grows. That arrow there is the arrow that makes many of us crazy because what you get to do is based on who you know. And so what you get to do, as I said, relates to what you know, and what you get to do really is based on who you know. So indeed, if I'm ever brought into an organization trying to help figure out why they're not developing the right kind of leadership they need in various parts of the organization, or with various, if you will, with people with certain kinds of demographic backgrounds, whether it's gender or enough people who maybe be from China or wherever they may need to be from, I often ask, how do you make those stretch assignments? Who's making those stretch assignments? What are you paying attention to in terms of figuring out who you can trust? Because, of course, we don't give high-stakes assignments to people that we don't trust. And so one of the dilemmas I think that we all need to work on in your own team, in your own organization, you need to pay a lot of attention to who are you giving assignments to, because who you give those assignments to will determine what they get to know and therefore their opportunities to grow and develop and contribute to the organization. And what we do see about great leaders is they pay attention not only to their, if you will, high potentials, they also pay attention to what one of my colleagues refers to as the, the B players, those solid players. They make sure those people also have opportunities as well, because everyone needs to have that to stay engaged and to have the knowledge they need to be able to contribute to the organization. So the final piece of the puzzle, the final sort of network that I'd like to refer to, is your developmental network. And so if you have your strategic network, your operational network, the last network you need to think about is, do you have the right people in your network to help you grow and develop over time so that you can continue to develop expertise and produce results that really matter to the organization? And so for sure, you want to think about behaving in ways that you will attract people to sponsor you, to protect you. We also need acceptance and friendship. But indeed, what we see is that those really great leaders and great bosses have a network of people that they rely on. They have, if you will, their own personal board of directors that, again, is quite diverse and allows them to reach out and sort of connect with different people than they might connect to, if you will, in their day-to-day activity. And to build these kinds of networks really requires you to be very strategic about it, because we're all very busy and it is hard to find the time to actually not only build these relationships but nurture and cultivate them. So again, you want to manage yourself, manage your network, and manage your team. Let me stop there and see where the questions are, and then we can look in more depth at any of these issues you'd like to.
Great. Thank you, Linda, for what you presented thus far. We do have a number of questions coming in. If there are any participants who would like to join in the conversation, you can enter your question in the questions box at the bottom right-hand corner of your webinar control panel. Linda, we have a question from Jim that stretches back to the beginning of your presentation. He asked, what % of leaders fail, and what does it cost, and how many new leaders are needed? I think this was at the point where you were talking about we don't know how many new leaders we need in an organization.
Yeah, actually it's hard for me to answer that question in general because what we see is it really varies in companies, because some companies are much better at selecting and developing leaders than others. So I can't give you a general answer to that. What I think often happens, frankly, and this is one of the things I think we all need to start with, is that we're not aware of the costs. We don't take the time to pay attention to those costs so that we see that this really is an area of major concern, or should be a strategic concern for companies. And the best example I can give you, and Jim, I know I need to go to another question, is one of my colleagues studied something she referred to as competent jerks. And competent jerks, I think we all know what competent jerks are. These are people who have a lot of expertise about something, but they're so abrasive it is very, very hard to work with them. And companies will often tell you, if they have them, and people will tell you, we have to keep him on the team because he's the only one that knows X, or she's the only one that knows Y. It turns out that over time, no one is actually using that expertise. People have moved away from them. They may be central in the network in the beginning, but they move to the periphery because it's so hard to work with them. And I think that companies, again, think that these people are valuable and important, and when you actually look at what's going on with them, they're not. So that's an example of a cost that we sometimes don't pay attention to. So when you don't help that person improve, if you will, you actually that is a cost that you need to be paying a lot of attention to, because they tend to do a lot of damage to the culture of the particular team or group or organization they're in.
Okay, great. Thanks, Linda. Next question comes from Janine. She's wondering, since nonprofits rely heavily on volunteer leadership, which creates a dynamic where they have influence outside of positional authority, do you have any thoughts, insights, or suggestions on organizations operating with this kind of dynamic?
Yes, in fact, I do a fair amount of work with not-for-profit organizations, and actually I think that the for-profit world has a lot to learn from you in the following way. One of the executives I'm studying is an executive who runs the infrastructure group of Google, and what he says is that all of us should assume that we're leading an organization of volunteers. Because if you have that mindset, which is actually something I didn't elaborate on about the myth versus the reality, if you knew that you were working with volunteers, you would make sure you explain to them, or you would understand that you better explain to them the purpose or make it worthwhile for them to be with you. And so, indeed, I do believe that, and in this particular book, we do talk about the volunteer notion, because that will, if you have that mindset, lead you to think about why are people here, what are they trying to get done, what really matters to them. So I do think that that mindset is an appropriate one for all of us to think about. I mean, one of the dilemmas I think and in volunteer organizations, if you don't make that purpose clear, obviously people aren't making a ton of money. They're not likely to stay or work very hard. Having said that, one of the challenges you all have is that because people might care so much about the purpose of whatever that organization is, they may not see that they have as many options in their area to move to, so they may stick around because there's no other organization that's sort of involved in that particular cause. So I think that the thing is that you do need to think about developing people in that world just as much as the other world, and think about what kinds of stretch opportunities you can give them. They're not going to be promotions necessarily, but it might be certain kinds of opportunities to work on certain task forces or whatever, because you do need them to develop, because those organizations also need to be able to adapt and change.
Great. That's a great answer and a good reminder for all of us to treat everybody like volunteers. The next question, considering your formula of character plus competence equals trust, are shades of competence important? And by that, we're referring to technical competence, social competence, etc. And there's a tag-along question on that, but I'll see what you have to say.
Oh, for sure. In fact, there are lots of different kinds of different competencies that might be required for a particular position. And in fact, one of the dilemmas I think we all face is that people often think that even though you might be able to develop sort of technical competence, you won't be able to develop leadership competence, because they think of leadership as being something, again, you're born with it or not. I think when people think about leadership that way, they're mostly thinking about whether or not you're a charismatic leader, someone, and charisma doesn't seem like something you can, quote, learn. Turns out there are, if you will, programs to help you, quote, become charismatic, in the sense that charisma is about people identifying with you. And what these programs are about is how you really share with people your authentic self in an effective way. So I would say that there are definitely shades, and the dilemma is if people decide there's some dimensions on which you can develop and others that you can't, and they don't give you a chance to work on those others. The other thing I would say about competence is what we see nowadays is that even if you have technical competence, you need to be T-shaped. That is, you need to be very deep about that technical competence, but you also need to be broad. You need to have a broad sense of the business so that you can really contribute and collaborate across, which is, again, why that strategic network matters a whole lot, even if you're a technical expert.
Right. And do you think that generational gaps influence how we perceive each other's competence, and is there anything we should do as bosses to be mindful of that?
Yes, as I mentioned very briefly when we started, I'm working on this book with Chief Technology Officer of Pixar, and now he's actually the Chief Technology Officer of Walt Disney Studios, and a young woman, Emily Stecker, who is the other person's name is Greg Brandow. Emily started with me, I think, when she was 22, 23, and we put her on the team, and we've been traveling around the world, literally around the world, studying leaders who are very good at innovation, because we really wanted to have her point of view. And she's an equal author for this research on innovation. And I think what we see there is, and I think she keeps us honest. Obviously, none of us can represent a whole generation, but not only does she read about that generation, but she is of it, and she helps us interpret. We have to interpret for her, and she has to interpret for us. So I think that it's helped me to see the world through her eyes. We were in Korea together, Dubai together, South Africa together, and she's interviewed the young people to find out what their point of view is about what's happening in a particular organization, because I think they talk to her differently than they talk to to Greg or to I, because we're not of their generation.
Sure. Can you speak to the order in which you listed the imperatives? So I noticed you started with manage yourself, then manage your network, and manage your team, especially with the latter two. Is there any reason why they went in that order?
Yes, maybe I went too quickly about that, for sure. The reason they went in that order, and I didn't kind of go through all this, is that I wrote a book years ago called Becoming a Manager, and lots of experienced managers read Becoming a Manager. And I've always been perplexed by that. And the main reason is because of that myth versus reality slide. Many of them end up, first off, when people derail, even when they're very senior, and it's around this sort of people stuff, it's for the same reasons they would have derailed earlier on in their careers. So I recently had a conversation with an executive who was just told he wasn't going to become the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And the reason he was told he wasn't going to become the CEO is that the board had decided he wasn't so good with his peers. And that because he wasn't so good with his peers, he had mixed relationships with them. He's brilliant, but not so good with peer relationships. They were worried about whether he'd be able to build the kind of senior team necessary to run the business. Now, frankly, this individual had problems with peers early on in his career as well. It's just now caught up with him, and it matters a lot more as you look at what it takes to run these global businesses nowadays. So that is why I actually think that Kent and I try to encourage him, and I think he agreed with me, that we should put managing your network before managing your team. So again, when you think about being the boss, you think about the team first. And so you think we'd start there, but we purposefully started, we did put managing your network before the boss piece because we see that as being so critical in today's organizations. And then the managing yourself seems like it has to go first because really, again, leadership is always about using yourself as an instrument to get things done. So you've got to understand the instrument. You have to understand what's the mindset you have about what you're getting ready to do in this role, whatever it might be, and is that the right mindset for being really great at it?
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. The next question I have is in regards to the psychological contract that you mentioned. How can you enforce it or revive it with your own boss when you feel that it's begun decaying? Or do you have any thoughts in regards to that relationship?
Well, you know, I must say the danger of the title being the boss is usually the first question we get on blogs and things is, what do I do about my bad boss? So Kent and I are debating whether we should write a book called What to Do About Your Bad Boss. We've had lots of conversations with people about that. I think that I think one of the things, again, the last few years in particular, maybe that your boss was always this way, people have been so focused on execution and just surviving in some ways, they have not thought about, if you will, and that the performance criteria in terms of effectiveness, they haven't thought about the other two. Are people happy? Are people developing? What's the culture of this group? Are we able to learn and adapt? And I think that those things have just been neglected because a lot of bosses have been in survival mode. And I think that one of the ways to maybe begin to have that conversation is, I don't know how long you've been with this boss, etc., is to talk about what the priorities were that you had, last year, and both for the organization or your team and also for yourself and your own development, and how those are changing. And how, when you discuss the change of your own priorities and your own development, really relate to where you see the business going. Because the point, again, is if the business is going here, I know this piece of the puzzle, going back to these competencies, but I don't know that piece of the puzzle. How can I do some sort of baby steps now to kind of learn and get some exposure to that? That area, so I can develop these competencies because I see some opportunity gaps here that we might be able to close if I actually had some more knowledge here, or could build different kind of relationships, different set of relationships with people in other parts of the organization or other customers to prepare ourselves to take advantage of that opportunity. I think whenever you approach a boss and you're not too happy and they haven't paid attention to that contract, you need to start with the business needs and how, if you are better at what you do, how you can help that business grow. And I think unless you take some risk and share with the boss how you're feeling or what's your view at this point in time about what's happening with your own career, I think that you shouldn't be surprised the boss isn't going to be able to, that the boss isn't helping you. So again, I'd maybe start with the business case about why you need to know these things, some of those opportunity gaps or performance gaps, and then with that understanding back into what you're looking for in terms of your own development. Or sharing with the boss how the culture has gotten so skewed in a performance direction that everything else that's about sort of being caring and the humanness of the organization has been lost.
Okay.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Linda. At this time, I'd like to bring a close to the questions. Thank you so much, Professor Hill, for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. It's really been a privilege.
At this juncture, I'd like to announce the winners of the book giveaway. 4 today's participants were randomly selected to receive a copy of Professor Hill's latest book, on which this webinar was based. Those winners are Marie from Ontario, Jerry from Missouri, Pablo from Spain, and Natalie from Florida. I'll be contacting you later to arrange for receiving your book. If you enjoyed today's webinar, I hope you will all be able to join us for the next installment of the Leadership Perspectives webinar series entitled The Power of Framing with Gail Fairhurst, which will be held on May 18th, 2011 at noon Eastern. Please visit www.ila-net.org/webinars for more details. Thank you for joining us today, and have a pleasant week.